Deportations, forced immigration, evacuation without return, repatriation, special military operations for forced resettlement. All part of the fate of Ukrainians in the 1940s and 1950s. Broken roots, that is how Ukrainian researchers and journalists called this tragic page in history. More than 1 million Ukrainians from the country's western regions suffered from these actions by the Bolsheviks. The wound inflicted by the communist regime on its citizens has not healed yet, as the consequences of these events are still being felt today. After the Soviet army occupied the western part known as Galicia, the question arose about defining the Soviet-Polish border. The then head of Ukraine, Nikita Khrushchev, had the intention of uniting all Ukrainian ethnic lands in Ukraine. Even a map of Helm region was made. However, the Kremlin rejected this proposal, as the plan for post-war Europe was already in place. At the final stage of the war, the Soviet Union saw a new Europe and a new world in this post-war era, and they wanted to make a map of Europe more profitable for themselves. New rulers came to power on the territory of modern-day Poland. They came to power on Red Army bayonets. The so-called Polish National Liberation Committee was created. It was created in Moscow in July 1944. It was a Muppet Soviet government on Polish territory. On September 9, 1944, an agreement was signed in Lublin between the government of Ukraine and the Polish Committee for National Liberation on the evacuation of the Ukrainian population from the territory of Poland and Polish citizens from the territory of the Ukrainian SSR. The boundary had to pass along the so-called Curzon line, but there was almost 700,000 Ukrainians to the east of this border. According to the terms of the agreement, the resettlement had to be voluntary. All this had to be completed on February 1, 1945, even before the start of the Yalta Conference. The transfer of the Ukrainian population from Poland dragged out until the end of 1946. It was conducted with significant violations of human rights, rights of citizens, in violation of all regulations. There were not enough vehicles for the resettlement of Ukrainian families. They transported them in old freight wagons along with cattle. People were on the road for several months, and although the settlers were promised compensation for the property they had to leave behind, this did not happen. Having arrived in Ukraine, it often happened that Ukrainian families were not resettled in villages but in districts, and they had to look for a place to live by themselves. Most deported Ukrainians were sent to eastern and southern regions of Ukraine, as well as to Poltava, Vinnytsia, and Kirovohrad regions. In early 1947, the government of Poland and Ukraine announced a joint statement on the end of the transfer of the Ukrainian population from Poland to the Ukrainian SSR and Poles from the territory of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic to Poland. However, according to the statistics of the resettlement commissions, 150,000 Ukrainians remained in the southeastern provinces of Poland. By supporting the idea of a monoethnic Poland, it was decided to relocate Ukrainians to the northern lands of Poland, the territories which became part of Poland after the end of the Second World War. This was former German territory. All this happened in the space of 4 months, from April 28 to July 28, 1947, and this operation was called Operation Vistula. It was carried out jointly by the Polish and Soviet armies. It was carried out in a very cruel and harsh way. Formal reason for its implementation was allegedly the death of the Deputy Minister of Defense of the Polish Republic, General Karol Swierczewski, in a battle with the unit of the Ukrainian insurgent army. The real purpose of the campaign was to disperse the Ukrainian minority among the Polish population with its further assimilation and the transformation of Poland into an ethnic mono-state. Such wording was contained in secret Polish documents dating back to those times. Troops surrounded those territories of compact residence of Ukrainians. They were given 2 hours to pack their things. They were loaded into wagons. People were taken at gunpoint. Houses were burned, as were churches and cemeteries were destroyed. The deportees were settled so that 1 or 2 families were received per village, so they couldn't form an organized community. They were strictly forbidden to return home. Those who tried to flee were thrown into the Yavorno concentration camp. About 3,900 Ukrainians passed through the camp in Yavorno. More than 30 Greek Catholic priests who either did not want to move or tried to return to their lands. The Soviet authorities in Western Ukraine used deportation against members of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists and soldiers of the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, their families, as well as those who supported the Ukrainian National Liberation Movement. From 1944 to 1946, about 40,000 people from the Rivne, Volyn, Lviv, Ternopil, Stanislav, Drohobych, and Chernivtsi regions were deported to remote areas of the Soviet Union. These were terrible actions of totalitarian power. My family village is not far from Drohobych, and Stry is not far, but in the Carpathians, in the mountains, and there were more than 100 fighters of the Ukrainian insurgent army there. Actually, there was not a single family that would not have been affected by eviction, because every family had someone in the Ukrainian insurgent army, so these families were evicted. Very few people came back alive from there. The very tough, hard story of both my home village and surrounding areas. People there fought for freedom, for independence, for Ukraine. The record year for deportations was 1947. More than 50 trains took almost 79,000 people from Ukraine. The impetus for this was adoption on September 10, 1947, by the Council of Ministers of the USSR of the decree on eviction from western regions of the Ukrainian SSR to these regions: Karaganda, Arkhangelsk, Vologda, Kemerovo, Kirovskaya, Molotov, now Perm, Sverdlovsk, Tyumen, Chelyabinsk, and Chita, of members of OUN families and active bandits who were arrested and killed in battles. The October days of 1947 became the most tragic for all the regions of western Ukraine. On October 21st, a special operation by the NKVD called West began. Internal forces troops surrounded villages, got into homes and arrested families. Not letting them understand what was going on, they pulled sick people from their beds, weak old people, crying children. They were allowed to quickly pack their stuff and were loaded quickly on lifts or trucks and sent to railway stations. With regard to evictions to the north, to Siberia and Kazakhstan, then the people befell simply terrible conditions. Many people who were evicted from our home village died right after they were thrown out of the carriages. Many old people did not survive. Many died the very first night. They just froze to death. My grandfather died there on the very first day. And this happened to thousands, or even hundreds of thousands of people. It was particularly tough during deportation to Kazakhstan. There was not even material to build a dugout, and people died in the open steppe. In order to weaken the national liberation movement in western Ukraine and curb the rebellious population of this region, the Soviet government began to evict entire villages of people. In 1949 and the early 1950s, so-called agricultural resettlement was practiced. When Ukrainians from western regions were moved to the southern and eastern regions of the Ukrainian SSR, they moved them to collective farms, and all this was disguised as help to those regions that suffered from the 1946 to 1947 famine. Or they talked about being relocated to support industry. They resettled entire villages. They were completely evicted, and everything in the old place was eliminated. In fact, these villages are called black holes on the map of Ukraine, because they were not revived later on. The village of Manevichi in Rivne region was resettled in this way for supporting insurgents who were nearby.
хто в Трускавці був, якщо дивився на Карпати, оце якраз...
If you've been to Truskavets and looked at the Carpathians, where the first mountains are, where you can see Zemivki and Orif. Zemivki used to be part of Orif. Now it's a separate village, and it was completely evicted, just because there was a solid number of soldiers of the Ukrainian insurgent army. And this village helped them, and it was decided to move them to Donetsk region. The people were evicted, and their houses were destroyed as much as possible.
Виселили, будинки, наскільки могли, поруйнували.
In total, during these so-called economic relocations, about 300,000 Ukrainians were moved from western regions to northeast Ukraine. But these notorious economic resettlements were not the last test of fate for Ukrainians. While in 1944 to 1947 Poland and Ukraine carried out special operations on the exchange of people, in 1951 the USSR decided to exchange territories with Poland, 480 square kilometers on both sides. The need for territorial corrections was explained by economic expediency. Poland received territories in Drohobych region containing oil and gas reserves. Instead, land around Chervonograd, with promising coal deposits, crossed over to Ukraine. More than 32,000 Ukrainians were subject to forced evictions. This operation was called Action 51.
Акція 51 – це фактично
Action 51 was in fact the completion of Soviet-Polish relations. It is equalization of the state border. An agreement between the Soviet Union and Poland was signed in February 1951. It was called On the Equalization of the State Border. The population of 45 villages in Drohobych region, which had to be relocated quickly, lived in these territories. Lists were compiled. People were given very little time to prepare for relocation. As always, people were deprived of the right to freely choose their place to live, although almost all of them wanted to settle in western Ukraine. But people acquiesced obediently, because every family at that time was already repressed as being anti-Soviet and class-hostile elements. An fact of resistance or sabotage meant an immediate reaction from repressive organs. All those expelled Ukrainians were scattered through the sparsely populated steppes of the Mykolaiv, Odessa, Donetsk and Kherson regions. The mountain people found themselves in unusual, hot regions.
Люди потерпіли і також дуже тяжко переносили саму звичайну зміну.
People suffered, and every climate change was very tough and hard to bear.
Важче було.
I remember how Mom told me that the hardest thing was to move from the fresh mountain air of the Carpathians to the Donetsk steppe.
Донецький степ.
When you look, just like air is excited by heat fluxes. There is nothing to breathe with. People were not accustomed to that. But that wasn't the worst thing. The worst thing was the fact that in October an official announcement of the completion of the relocation campaign was made. But only a quarter of newcomers got houses before winter set in. People suffered from food shortages, but there was no opportunity to return because patrols controlled railway stations. The direct consequence of deportations was a catastrophic decline in the population of western Ukraine and the complete destruction of individual settlements. These repressive actions and deportations carried out by totalitarian regimes against Ukrainians became an expression of the anti-popular nature of the regimes of the Soviet Union and the Polish People's Republic. When one stroke of a pen broke the fate of hundreds of thousands of people, everything was lost and families were completely separated.